In the silence of a Moscow apartment, located in the famous House on the Embankment, the sound of the doorbell on the night of May 13, 1937, rang not as a demand to open, but as the final blow of a gong. August Ivanovich Kork, head of the Frunze Military Academy, a man whose bearing maintained the impeccable standards of the old imperial school even under red banners, was not asleep. In those months, insomnia had become not just an ailment, but a professional trait of the higher command staff. He sat at his desk, looking at the unfolded maps of the Gulf of Finland, which he knew by heart, down to every shallow, every hidden current. These maps, once instruments for the defense of the state, were now turning into the geography of his sentence. Behind the door stood people who had come not to discuss the strategy of Leningrad's defense, but to seek confirmation of a betrayal that did not exist. But in the logic of the approaching era, the absence of evidence became only confirmation of a particularly sophisticated conspiracy. Kork slowly rose, adjusted his tunic, a habit ingrained in his subconscious over decades of service, and stepped towards the inevitable, leaving behind not just a room, but an entire era of military romanticism, which that night finally gave way to the cold pragmatism of the Great Terror. August Kork's path to this fateful night began long before the revolutionary whirlwinds, in the cool and restrained landscapes of Estland. His origin, Estonian peasant roots, paradoxically intertwined with the elite education of the Nikolaev General Staff Academy. This combination created a unique alloy, a cold northern temperament multiplied by the mathematical precision of staff thinking. When the empire collapsed and the world split into white and red, Kork made a choice that seemed incomprehensible to many. A general staff officer, a bearer of traditions, he sided with the Bolsheviks. But his Bolshevism was not rally-based, not shouting, but purely functional. He saw in the Red Army the only force capable of holding the disintegrating space of the former empire within unified borders. However, it was precisely this rationalism, devoid of ideological fanaticism, that laid the first stone in the foundation of future distrust. For political commissars, he always remained a military specialist, an outsider, a man who knew how to fight, but could not and did not want to hate the enemy with the required class fury. Service in the Baltic became for Kork not just a stage in his career, but the very crucible where his glory and simultaneously his demise were forged. The Baltic region in the 20s was a complex knot of geopolitical contradictions. Here, at the junction of borders with independent Finland and Estonia, every fleet movement was scrutinized. Kork, possessing strategic vision, understood that the Baltic Fleet was in a deplorable state. Ships that had survived the ice cruise needed repairs. Crews diluted by revolutionary freedom needed iron discipline, and coastal defense existed only on paper. He plunged into the work of restoring combat readiness with the methodicalness that was characteristic of him. But it was here that his professional view clashed with a new reality. Kork insisted that the defense of Leningrad was impossible without considering the geographical specifics of the Gulf of Finland, without a complex system of mine barrages and interaction with coastal artillery. He saw the sea as a chessboard, where each piece had its own significance. However, in Moscow, these plans were viewed differently. Where Kork saw tactical necessity, the political leadership perceived suspicious passivity. His strategy, based on staunch defense and mining, began to be interpreted as defeatism. Why wasn't the army commander planning daring amphibious assaults? Why was he so cautious about sending ships into the open sea? In these questions, the whispers of future accusations could already be heard. The situation was exacerbated by the fact that Kork, being an ethnic Estonian, maintained a certain mental connection with his Baltic neighbors. His knowledge of the language, culture, and geography, which should have served as an intelligence advantage, would later be twisted by the perverted logic of investigators into a channel for communication with foreign intelligence services. The quote "zero" began to appear not on maps, but in folders of denunciations, where each of his decisions regarding the redeployment of ships or changes in firing sectors was interpreted as preparing a corridor for the enemy fleet. The external conflict surrounding the figure of the army commander grew as the country industrialized. Here, Grigory Orjonikidze, the people's commissar of heavy industry, a fiery, direct man utterly devoted to the idea of a forced surge, entered the scene. The clash between Kork and Orjonikidze became a clash of two philosophies: military meticulousness and industrial assault. Kork demanded quality. He refused to accept ships and equipment for armament if they had the slightest defects. For him, a faulty turbine was not just a defect, but a potential cause of crew death. Orjonikidze, on the other hand, pushed the plan. He needed numbers, tons, units that could be presented to the party as proof of success. Endless disputes about armor quality, engine reliability, and delivery times escalated into personal animosity. Orjonikidze, accustomed to breaking resistance with his authority, encountered a cold wall of Kork's argumentation. August Ivanovich wrote memorandums full of technical terms and calculations, proving that haste in naval matters was unacceptable. These documents, instead of convincing the leadership, accumulated as evidence of his quote, "1". In the corridors, whispers began that Kork was deliberately slowing down the rearmament of the fleet, nitpicking to weaken the country's defense capabilities in the face of an impending war. No one wanted to hear that an engine assembled with violated tolerances would stop on its very first combat voyage. In the eyes of the party nomenclature, demandingness turned into sabotage. Orjonikidze, perhaps, did not wish Kork personal harm, but the system they were building did not tolerate those who placed professional standards above political expediency. This external conflict was overlaid by a profound internal rift. Kork lived with the feeling of walking on thin ice. He saw how the face of the army was changing. The old officers, with whom he spoke the same language of military science, were replaced by new cadres, energetic, loyal, but often glaringly incompetent. His so-called softness towards former white officers was not a political stance, but personnel despair. He tried to save those few specialists who could distinguish a map from an agitational poster. Each time he stood up for another arrested engineer or navigator, he spent his personal limit of trust. He was accused of liberalism, charged with creating a nest of conspirators at the Frunze Academy, and he was simply trying to preserve the intellectual core of the armed forces. In Kork's soul, there was a constant struggle between a soldier's duty and a human's conscience. He understood that he served a regime that devoured its creators, but he saw no other path. Emigration was impossible for him. He could not conceive of himself outside of Russia, outside of the army. It was a tragic stoicism, to do his job as well as possible, knowing there would be no gratitude. His correspondence from those years, sparse and restrained, permeated with loneliness. He was an outsider among his own. For the Red commanders, to quote 0, too educated, to quote 1, for former comrades who found themselves on the other side of the border, a traitor who sold his sword to the Bolsheviks. This loneliness was amplified by his character, reserved, not prone to familiarity. He did not participate in drunken feasts, did not sing revolutionary songs by the campfire. He worked. And this work, his fanatical devotion to his cause, became his only refuge from the growing madness of the surrounding world. The ideological level of the conflict in which August Kork was embroiled concerned the very essence of building a new society. It was a debate about the place of competence in the dictatorship of the proletariat. Could a professional be trusted if his class origin or past was not impeccable? The system answered, no. Loyalty became more important than skill. Kork, however, embodied the principle of meritocracy. Only results, knowledge, and experience mattered. His attempts to introduce advanced Western military theories into the Red Army, his fascination with the works of German strategists, his insistence on a deep study of military history, all of this was interpreted as bowing to the West. In the atmosphere of spy mania of the 1930s, knowing foreign languages and reading foreign journals itself became evidence. The paradox was that the Soviet Union desperately needed to modernize its army. But it destroyed precisely those who could carry out this modernization. Kork, as one of the theorists of deep operation and inter-service cooperation, was an architect of future victory. But his blueprints were declared enemy plans. The accusation of a, quote, "2" became a grotesque reflection of his attempts to understand the probable adversary. He studied the Finnish army, analyzed its strengths and weaknesses to know how to fight it. The investigators, however, turned this on its head. If you know the enemy so well, it means you are collaborating with him. The logic of absurdity triumphed over common sense. The moment of transformation came in the spring of 1937. Arrests among the high command ceased to be isolated incidents and turned into an avalanche. When Tukhachevsky was taken, Kork understood. The circle had closed. His name inevitably stood in the lists next to the marshal's name. They were people of the same circle, of the same mentality, although they often argued on professional matters. At this moment, August Ivanovich probably realized that his defense strategy, honest service and professionalism, no longer worked. The rules of the game had changed. Now it didn't matter how well he had prepared the Academy's students or how skillfully he had laid mines in the bay. All that mattered was which scenario the scriptwriters from Lubyanka decided to cast him in. Kork's internal transformation in the last days before his arrest was a transition from active resistance to fatal acceptance. He stopped writing exculpatory letters, stopped trying to get an audience with Voroshilov. He put the Academy's affairs in order, signed the last orders, as if he wanted to leave behind a perfect order that would contrast with the chaos of the coming process. This was his last officer's word, to leave his post in impeccable condition, even if tomorrow he would be declared an enemy of the people. He knew that his Estonian origin and service in the Baltic would be the main trump cards of the prosecution. The Finnish conspiracy was a convenient construct. It explained all the failures in the fleet, all the technical problems, all the delays. A culprit was needed, and the ideal candidate was found. The climax of this drama unfolded not on the battlefield, but in the investigator's office, and finally in the courtroom of the Special Judicial Presence of the Supreme Court on June 11, 1937. The interrogations were exhausting. Kork was demanded to confess that he had transmitted secret codes and minefield diagrams to Finnish intelligence. He was accused of creating sabotage groups ready to blow up Baltic Fleet ships at _, 0 _. The physical and psychological pressure was monstrous. But even in the interrogation protocols written under the investigator's dictation, the absurdity of what was happening breaks through. Kork, a man who dedicated his life to strengthening defenses, was forced to sign lines stating that he had destroyed these defenses. The court session lasted only a few hours. No lawyers, no defense witnesses, no right to appeal. August Kork stood before the judges, his former comrades in arms, pale but upright. When he was given the final word, he did not beg for mercy. He understood that the verdict had already been written and approved. It was a farce, played out to legitimize terror. The accusation of transmitting information to Germany and Finland sounded like a verdict not only for him, but for the entire old military school. His conviction meant that knowledge, experience, and intellect in the Red Army were henceforth declared outlawed if they were not supported by blind, animalistic devotion to the leader. The sentence, the highest measure of social protection, was announced on the night of June 12th. The execution of the sentence put an end to the life of a man, but opened a huge gaping wound in the body of the fleet and army. The execution of Cork and other military leaders became a signal for the beginning of a total purge in the Baltic. Following the army commander, hundreds of officers whom he had trained, whom he had protected, whom he had promoted, went under the knife. The fleet was decapitated. Experienced captains were replaced by lieutenants rapidly graduated from academies. Fear paralyzed initiative. Ship commanders were afraid to make independent decisions, fearing that any mistake would be called sabotage, as happened with Cork. Those very mine barrages and defense plans that August Ivanovich advocated were abandoned or revised as subversive, which echoed with a terrible price just a few years later when the real war began. The resonance of the Cork case extends far beyond 1937. His story is a lesson in how a state, in pursuit of absolute control, destroys its own protective mechanisms. The accusation of sabotage became a universal tool for dealing with the undesirable, for covering up the incompetence of party bosses. The story of August Kork teaches us that professionalism without civic courage is defenseless in society. Technocrats who believe they can simply do their job away from politics inevitably become victims of this politics when it turns into a meat grinder. Today, looking at the events of those years, we see not just the tragedy of one admiral and army commander. We see a systemic failure when paranoia becomes a state ideology. Kork's softness towards the whites, for which he was blamed, was actually a manifestation of humanity and foresight, an attempt to mend the torn fabric of society. His disputes with Orjonikidze were not sabotage, but a struggle for the lives of sailors. The tragedy is that his warnings, his demands for quality, his strategic calculations were absolutely correct. The war that began 4 years after his death cruelly confirmed the correctness of enemy of the people, Cork. The Baltic Fleet was trapped, mine warfare became the main means of struggle, and the lack of qualified personnel led to heavy losses during the Tallinn crossing. Returning mentally to that night of May 13th, we see not just an arrest, we see the moment when history took a wrong turn. The man standing at the table with maps of the Gulf of Finland embodied an alternative, a path of competence, dignity, and respect for knowledge. His departure into oblivion under Chekist escort became a symbol of how a country voluntarily abandons its intellect. The door closed, footsteps faded on the stairs, and only emptiness remained in the apartment. But this emptiness proved louder than any slogans. The echo of gunshots in the Lubyanka basements, which ended August Kork's life, resonated with the cannonade of 41st year, when the fleet so sorely lacked his mind, his prudence, and his __0 _maps. His figure remains in history as a reminder that loyalty to the motherland and loyalty to the regime are not always the same thing. Cork was devoted to the sea, the army, and the country. The regime, however, demanded loyalty to itself personally. The mismatch of these vectors cost him his life, but preserved his honor in the eyes of descendants. The Baltic waves, cold and gray, for which he cared so much, continue to crash against the granite embankments, preserving the memory of one who wanted to make them an impregnable fortress, but was declared a traitor for knowing their disposition too well. The story of August Kork is a story of professional solitude, of how difficult it is to be an expert in a world of dilettantes vested with power, of how easy it is to turn a person's biography into an indictment simply by changing plus signs to minus. An Estonian means a spy. A former general staff officer means a hidden enemy. A demanding superior means a saboteur. This scheme, perfected on Cork, became a template for annihilating the nation's elite. But through decades of oblivion, the true image of the army commander emerges. A focused, intelligent, tragically calm man who, until his last breath, remained true to an oath given not so much to the government as to the profession of defender itself. His fate is a warning to all of us about how fragile the world of reason is in the face of the irrational fear of power. And as long as we remember this, we have a chance not to repeat these mistakes, not to let suspicion again replace evidence, and not to let political expediency trample human dignity and professional honor. Concluding this sorrowful overview, it is worth noting one more detail. In the archives, among the dry lines of protocols, evidence has been preserved of how Cork behaved in his last days. Even broken by torture, in his testimony he tried to exonerate his subordinates, take the blame upon himself, confuse the investigation with technical details to minimize damage to the fleet. This was his last battle. Quiet, invisible, hopeless, but no less heroic for that. He mined the interrogation protocols as carefully as he once planned to mine the Gulf of Finland, hoping that at least someone would be saved in that chaos. And this last, invisible operation of Army Commander Cork deserves to be remembered no less than his past victories on the fronts of the Civil War. This is the ultimate justice of history. All that is secret becomes manifest, and the brand of traitor, in the end, burns away, revealing beneath it the gold of true patriotism.